thank you for joining us. My name is Kelly Weiner, and I'm a partner at Scott Legal PC. And today we're going to spend some time talking about the EB-5. So a few housekeeping items before you get started. Some of you may know that the firm was founded on an E-2 visa several years ago. Ian Scott has been on several visas in the United States, including an F1, TN, B, and H-1B. As such, we know what you're going through with the immigrant and non-immigrant process. The firm is a full-service immigration law firm, and we offer immigration services in a number of different areas, including E2s, E1s, TNs, L1s, family immigration, national interest waivers, EB-5, extraordinary ability visas, and more. So at the end of this webinar, we'll send out several useful tools. One will be the PowerPoint presentation we'll go through today. Also a link to where you can download guides that go through visa options in more detail, a link to where you can sign up for additional webinars. The webinar is being recorded and will be available on YouTube. We will send the link for that as well. We encourage you to subscribe and hit the notification button as we upload immigration videos regularly. We will also send you a link where you can set up consultations. So as I mentioned, my name is Kelly Weiner. I'm a partner at Scout Legal, and I'll be taking you through the presentation today. All right, so for the EB-5, there are two ways to make your investment. One is with a regional center, and one is through direct investment into a new commercial enterprise. And so there's kind of listed out here different things that apply to each, and one or the other may be favorable depending on your preference. So for the regional center, it's really a fairly passive investment. Essentially, you're going to transfer the funds into the regional center, and they will take it from there. You don't really have any involvement with the project that the funds are being allocated towards. There are high administration fees with a low return on that. So, that you can't have any guaranteed return in this process. And the fees for, the regional center can be thousands of dollars. There's also a risk of the projects failing, right? So there can be no guaranteed return. Risk is part of the EB-5 process. And if the project fails, that can be difficult. That can be something where perhaps you may have invested, this very large amount of money and cannot proceed. And there may be things you can do to remediate this, but there may not. So there is that risk. And that means that you want to be very diligent in choosing which projects you invest into. Make sure you're choosing a regional center that has a, strong history, and look into, what is the failure rate? How many projects have failed? How many, completions have they had? And take that into account when you're doing your assessment. With a regional center, you can count indirect jobs. So job creation is an important part of the EB-5, and kind of there's two ways: direct job creation, which is clear, you're making, jobs for, U.S. workers, or indirect job creation, which is something that, you can use if you're in a regional center, and they will provide the documentation to you that shows that the proper indirect job creation, was in place. The regional centers are usually in targeted employment areas, which means the investment amount is likely to be the lower required investment of $800,000. And you can support more than one EB-5 investor. So often regional centers will have many, many, many EB-5 investors, and the money is all being deployed for various, large scale projects, infrastructure, rural projects, things like that. So direct investment. For direct investment, you can only have one EB-5 investor. So you can't kind of pool funds. But you do have more control over the process. So for somebody who's maybe very entrepreneurial, feels very comfortable running a company, that they can create these jobs and wants that control over their funds and the project, direct investment can be a better option. So again, you have control over the process, you have control over hiring, over the investment funds, how are they deployed, a potential for a higher return over time if the business is very successful. Only direct jobs will be counted. So there's not the same, indirect, job creation that's available to regional centers. The program is also more stable and not subject to reauthorization the way the regional center program is. And funds already invested can count towards the investment, assuming you're able to source those funds properly for EB-5, which can be, quite difficult to do. All right, so the general EB-5 requirements. So one is investment. You need to invest either $800,000 or $1,050,000 into a new commercial enterprise. That investment has to be, fully sourced, show the legitimate source of funds, and the investment has to create 10 full-time jobs for U.S. workers. And so these are kind of the main overarching requirements of the program. Um, there are kind of three filings that you do for an EB-5. So one is going to be the I-526. That is the first form that's filed showing the proof of the source of funds and the investment. The second is the green card filing. This is through either consular processing or adjustment of status. And then the third is the I-829, which is when you remove the conditions on your 2-year conditional green card by showing that you have in fact sustained your investment and created the 10 full-time jobs. All right, let's talk a little bit about each one. So investment, again, 800,000 or 1,050,000 into a new commercial enterprise. You're allowed to use the lower minimum investment amount when you are investing in a targeted employment area, which is going to be a rural area or an area with a high unemployment rate. So that is kind of a technical definition. So you want to make sure that if you are trying to rely on a targeted employment area, that you've done this, what we call a TEA analysis, before, you decide where you're going to locate your business, if you're doing a direct investment or for a regional center. Again, most of those are already kind of in a TEA. So what investment can be included? So you can make the investment over time. The investment does need to be put into the company. For the regional center, you'll have transferred the full amount to the regional center prior to filing. If you're doing, a business, you'll have transferred the money into that business bank account. You'll have either spent or committed some of it, but you can make additional investment over time. You can include contracts. For example, if you're doing big renovations, all of that can be included in your application, and then the payments can be made over time. So important to understand investment versus retained earnings. So retained earnings cannot be counted as investment. That's not something that they include in the allocation or the calculation of investment. Also very important to understand the differences between the E2 and the EB-5. So the E2 is an investor visa for a non-immigrant temporary visa, and it does also have a source of funds requirement like the EB-5. It also requires a substantial investment, although a much lower investment is acceptable for the E2 than the EB-5, and there's no kind of set minimum investment amount. However, the source of funds for the E2 is a much kind of lower standard than the source of funds requirement for EB-5. So, for example, for an E2, if you got your funds from selling a property, you would include proof of the sale documents, proof of you receiving that money, and then proof of you transferring that to the E2 business bank account and being spent on expenditures, or proof of you transferring it to purchase an E2 business. For an EB-5, you would need to go back much further. You would need to show how you got the money to purchase the property in the first place. You'll need to include multiple years of tax returns. Gifts can be permitted for the EB-5, but again, the gift giver will need to provide lots of documentation, including their tax returns, personal documents, depending on where the funds come from. So if just because you've gotten an E2, you should not assume that all the investment that you made into your E2 can be included for EB-5, or that the source of funds documents that you included for E2 would be sufficient for EB-5. So if you're somebody who's starting an E2 and you want to plan ahead for an EB-5, it's a good idea to hire an attorney, who will look at both of those things, ahead of time, because again, like there will be certain things that you just cannot include for EB-5, and there'll be certain, source of funds that would be acceptable for E2 where you'll need to go much, much deeper for EB-5. So you want to kind of vet those in advance if that's your long-term plan. All right, so job creation. So 10 full-time jobs. Again, for direct investment, that just needs to be 10 full-time jobs shown on W-2s, payroll, things like that. For regional centers, you do get this benefit of being able to count indirect employment, which will be calculated, and the information will be provided to you by the regional center. There has to be a link between your investment and the job creation. So if the investment needs to be put into the company and spent towards things that are going to generate those jobs. A detailed business plan is an important part of an EB-5, particularly if you're doing a direct investment. You'll be drafting that yourself. If you're doing a regional center, they will often provide you with that business plan, and you'll need to review that and make sure you feel comfortable with the project you're investing in and how your money will be used. Um, Important to document these full-time positions and qualified workers. So keep good records. If you're doing a direct investment, make sure you're filling out the I-9s correctly, you're having your taxes done correctly, and that you have all that documentation because that will be required at the I-829 stage. So the EB-5 filing, as I mentioned, three steps. The first one is the I-526. This is where you're going to gather all those extensive source of funds documents that we talked about. You're going to prove that you've made the investment, whether that's transferring the money to the regional center or transferring the money into the EB-5 business bank account and showing the proof of the expenditures that have been made so far. That will be filed, and then those take a very long time to process, often several years. They are, again, like looked at with a lot of scrutiny, so not uncommon to get a request for evidence, which can extend the processing time. Once that's approved, then you move on to the green card step. You could, if you were in the United States in a status that allowed for it, have filed for an adjustment of status. And the I-526, in many of the categories, is current, meaning green cards are available, so people can concurrently file their I-485 if they'd like to do that. That can be beneficial. If their underlying status runs out, they can apply for work and travel authorization based on the pending adjustment of status. Another option is consular processing. So if you're fully outside the United States, you have no status in the US, or you want to be abroad, you travel a lot, you don't have an H-1B or an L, then a consular process would be right for you. And that would be that you would go to the consulate, attend a medical exam, they would do an interview, and then you'll be granted a 2-year conditional green card. So then the last filing, the I-829, the I-829 has to be filed in the 90 days prior to your conditional green card expiring. You will get a receipt notice that extends your legal permanent resident status, and you will then travel with your expired green card and your I-829 receipt notice that extends the status. And that's the status that you'll be in while it's pending until it's finally approved. And then you'll get your permanent 10-year, legal permanent resident card. So the entire process end to end is quite long. It can be several years, even up to, 7, 8, 9, 10 years, just because the processing times on the I-526, then maybe a few years for the I-485 or consular process, and then the I-829 itself can also take a few years. All right, so key changes to the program. So there were some major changes to the EB-5 program, based on the EB-5 Reform and Integrity Act. So this was in 2022. The biggest changes were changes to investment amount. So the standard investment amount increased to $1,050,000. The lower TEA investment amount increased from $500,000 to $800,000. There was also program authorization, where the regional center program was reauthorized through September 30th, 2027. Regional center filings filed before September 30th, 2026 will be adjudicated to avoid delays and uncertainty. So a lot of people are watching that date and trying to get their EB-5s in before that date. There was also a change to how they calculate and look at TEAs. So the US government will now determine what is a TEA. This can make it harder to qualify for that lower investment amount if you're doing a direct investment. Again, most regional centers will be located in TEAs. There's also project set-asides, which are, can be very relevant, in terms of whether the category is current for people born in India and China. So good to take a look at these. 20% of EB-5 visas for, rural areas, 10% for high unemployment, and 2% for infrastructure projects, trying to direct these funds in areas that will, positively benefit the US. All right. So, the filing changes that happened with this new, Reform and Integrity Act. One was the ability to file the I-485 concurrently with the I-526. This was a major benefit because the I-526 can be pending for so many years. Sometimes it can be very difficult to, maintain underlying status for that entire period of time. And so being able to file the I-485 concurrently was a great benefit because you can also file for work and travel authorization. There has been a new memo issued in May of 2026 that does mean that you should think more carefully about whether you do an adjustment of status or consular processing. That being said, for example, let's say you're here on an H-1B and you want to file for adjustment of status, maybe, a good thing to do, very clear that H-1B is a dual intent visa, so no issue with your underlying visa status. and you can continue to extend as, up to the 6 years, and then, kind of work based on the work and travel authorization. And although the new memo emphasizes the, existing rule, which is just that adjustment of status is discretionary and you should be able to explain discretionary factors in your favor, making this large investment and it contributing to the U.S. economy could be seen as a very positive, factor in your favor. All right, so documenting the source of funds. This includes administrative fees, legal, regional center, and filing fees. So you don't just need to document the source of funds for the 800,000 or the 1,050,000. You also need to document the source of funds for all these administrative fees. So be very careful about where the funds are coming from. Discuss this with your attorney before you transfer any money to make sure that you're going to have that source of funds documentation. Um, there were also clarifications on loans and gifts. So the ability to change programs, if the regional center fails or closes. So this was also a big benefit. So, good faith investors can complete the permanent residence process despite the termination of an EB-5 entity or regional center. And it protects the petitioner in the event the regional center program expires in the future. So because of the history where some people had, really bad experiences with, regional centers that were doing things that were, led to significant failure, or issues being caused by the expiration of the program because of issues in Congress. These two provisions are very helpful to protect investors. All right. So what else should you consider? So, you do have to, make an at-risk investment. So you have to have that invest the money, spend the money, or the intent to invest, provide those contracts, proof of how the money will be allocated. Think about whether you're going to have a loan or a gift and make sure in advance that the loan or the gift is structured in a way that is permitted for the EB-5. If it's going to be a gift, you also need to make sure that the person who's giving the gift to you is comfortable providing a lot of very sensitive financial documentation, and that if there's a request for evidence several years in the future, that they will be willing to still provide that to you. So think and, consider, down the road, because again, it can take many years to get the EB-5s approved. And during that time, if you get a request for evidence and, you got a gift from somebody and you've fallen out of touch or something like that, that can be a big problem. So considerations for purchasing a business. So purchasing a business, while this will work for something like an E2, if you are purchasing a business and transferring money, to the seller of the business, that is not investment for EB-5 purposes. It's not related to job creation. It's just literally you transferring money to a seller. So that doesn't really work for, for an EB-5. It would be more that you would need to, the money needs to go into the business bank account and be spent on things, directed towards job creation. For the investment structure, how much do you need to own? There is no set amount. So this is again different from the E2. The E2, a treating country national has to own at least 50% of the business. For the EB-5, there's no set amount. It can be a very, very small amount and often is, especially in the regional center context. The investment structure, how much do you need? Guaranteed return of investment. This does not work. You cannot have a guaranteed return for the EB-5. That's not permitted. And then again, moving from an E2 to EB-5, think about what investment can count. Again, you won't just be able to include everything. There's many things like legal fees, that may be included for E2 investment, can't be included for EB-5. Make sure that you're planning ahead of time, saving the documents, getting an analysis done of your source of funds from an EB-5 perspective, because again, what might work for E2 and be totally fine is not necessarily going to work for EB-5. Think about job creation, timing of job creation. And then, as I discussed, buying a business is not going, and you're transferring the money to the seller is not going to get you, where you need to go for EB-5. All right, what else to be aware of? So timing considerations. Again, EB-5 is an extremely kind of long process with 3 steps, each of which can take several years. The I-526, kind of the longest, and then the green card process, usually a couple years, and then the I-829, again, a few years. There are country-specific quotas, although most, worldwide, the EB-5 category is current. There are some backlogs for certain types of categories, if you're born in India or China. So just be aware of that. You may not be able to concurrently file your I-485 or immediately apply for the green card. You may be waiting outside the United States for quite a long time, if you are not doing the adjustment of status. So travel considerations and visa expiration dates. So if you're in the United States, on a visa and you want to stay here, and you filed your adjustment of status, unless you're in H or L, status and returning to work for that employer, you can't travel once your I-485 is filed. So if you are someone who needs to travel a lot, the consular process may be right for you. That being said, your ability to stay in the U.S. is going to be, dependent on the visa that you have, and not having anything to do with your EB-5 if you're not filing that adjustment of status. You also want to think about dual intent considerations. So let's say you're here on a student visa and you've applied for an EB-5 and you are going to do consular processing. It might be difficult to renew your F1 visa, because you will have to disclose that you have, a pending immigrant petition. That being said, you can always show I don't intend to adjust status. I intend to consular process. My stay is temporary, for the F1, and then I'm going to leave. That being said, having a visa and applying for the EB-5 on a visa that does not have dual intent, meaning intent that allows you to be here temporarily and also intend to remain permanently, that can be tricky for EB-5, particularly in this environment where they are looking much closer at everyone's intent and scrutinizing all applications very closely. Um, Sometimes, it's a good idea to pursue parallel green card strategies. So it may be that people who are applying for the EB-5, maybe they're also eligible for the EB-2 national interest waiver. Maybe they're doing, big things in their communities and making a large impact, with the different businesses they're running. Maybe you pursue both at the same time, and then depending on kind of which one is current faster or which one gets adjudicated faster, you may want to, go with that one. But it is something to consider that you don't only need to pursue one green card at a time. If there are multiple categories that apply to you and you're concerned about how long it's going to take for the EB-5, you could pursue another type green card category if that's something that you're eligible for. Planning ahead is key. It's very, very important to plan ahead, again, because this is a multi-year process. And once you file this petition, this I-526, you are showing that you have this intent to eventually get a green card in the United States. So again, plan ahead, think about, how you're going to manage the many years in between actually filing and getting your green card. That is something that you want to discuss with an attorney ahead of time. All right. So we've come to the end of the presentation, and thank you all for joining. It was wonderful to share this information with you. We will send a follow-up email with all the information I mentioned at the start of the presentation. I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Thank you.